Hello, I'm Karen Marsh from RG Law and I'm joined by Khanna, Head of Conveyancing.
Hi, Karen.
Welcome.
Hello.
So Tina, what information do you need around source of funds and what does your conveyancer need to know with regards to the property transaction?
Thank you, Karen. Yes, source of funds are an extremely important part of the conveyancing transaction. It's probably best to start with what that actually means and what source of funds actually are. Quite simply, it's an explanation of the funds that you're using to buy your property. It's a legal duty for solicitors to obtain that information from you. Conveyancers are actually quite heavily regulated in this area and they have to comply with the money laundering regulations. So this is why your conveyancer needs this information from you. Failure to actually provide that information and for your conveyancer to get that information from you can have serious repercussions such as huge fines and even in the worst case scenarios, imprisonment. So source of funds is really important and provides a clear picture to your conveyancer as to your sourcing and the wealth check to make sure you can afford the property that you're actually purchasing.
Right. But we do have a lot of clients that find this quite intrusive. So how do we deal with that?
I think it's really important to remember that it's required of every client and the standard is the same for every client. And everyone has a different source. So we are, basically following that regulation. It's not that we're trying to be intrusive or offensive. We just have to go to that level of detail to satisfy the requirements on us because as I mentioned, we are heavily regulated in this area. So it's key to get this information to your conveyancer and understand actually what is needed from you right at the start of the transaction. Your conveyancer will help you with that. They'll give you guides around that. And, it's good to talk about the subject as early as possible to avoid delays further down the line.
Right, okay. So what sort of proof would you actually need?
So it really depends on your source. It may be that you have one source for the property purchase, or you may have a few different sources. But depending on the source of funds, you would then need different documentary evidence and different information to satisfy the checks. I think it might be good to give you a few examples of that so we can see what that looks like in practice. So, for example, if your source of funds is the sale of a previous property, then your conveyancer will need to know how much you obtained from the proceeds from the sale, but they will also need to see documentary evidence such as a completion statement from the solicitor who acted for you on the sale, together with a corresponding bank account. Show those funds actually going into your account. And then the current link, which would be the funds still in your account to fund the purchase of the property. If you're purchasing the property via inheritance, it may be that you were left a nice gift by a grandparent, then that would go back to asking for a copy of the will and then correspondence from the solicitor showing the amount that you were due and the executor sending those funds to you, to your bank account, and again showing that in a bank account. So there are different steps to satisfy depending on the source of what the funds are. And I think it's important to be really clear with your conveyancer if it's one source or several sources and show that explanation really quickly. And then whatever your conveyancer asks of you, you work on that information and getting it to your conveyancer as soon as possible and answering it as fully as possible. But if you're still unsure, best thing to do is ask.
Okay. And at what stage in the transaction would I have to provide that information?
Really important to get it to your conveyancer as soon as possible. It's more than likely you'll be asked about it right near the start when you're sending all your initial paperwork back. It's really important you'll probably be sent a questionnaire of some sort to document everything and provide an explanation as to what those funds are. When your conveyancer asks you for that information, I would deal with it as quickly as possible because really what you don't want is that you're unable to satisfy those checks and you get to the point of when you're thinking about completion dates, you're thinking about moving into that property and suddenly you can't pass the checks and the conveyancer can no longer act for you. Because remember, we have these really, really strict guidelines and regulations that we have to follow. So the quicker you can satisfy that with the help of your conveyancer, they're there to help, the better for your transaction.
Okay. And what happens if I've got a third party gifting me money? So how would I then prove that?
Okay, really common scenario actually. One of the most popular lenders for purchases of properties is now Bank of Mum and Dad. It's a really, really nice way. Yeah, exactly. You might know this. But yeah, definitely. You know, it's a really good way to get first-time buyers on the property ladder, and the bank of mum and dad is massively important and very common in the conveyancing world now. So if you're actually buying with a gift, there's certain information and documents that you need to start collating early doors, really, as soon as possible. So your conveyancer will need to know who that person is, what the relationship is, how much they're providing to you as well. You will need to go through the same process of getting the source of funds for that giftor, verifying their ID, and you will need in writing from that giftor that they're giving you the X amount of money for the purchase of this property. It is a gift, it's non-refundable, but also really importantly, they don't actually need an interest note on the property. So it is, it's a full-on gift of those funds. But then you also have to factor in if there's a mortgage lender. So a mortgage lender will have their own requirements around gifted funds. So conveyancers have to work really closely with the lender to make sure that those checks are fully complied with as well. So they will need all that confirmation in writing, what we just went through. So if there's no interest, it's not repayable, how much it is and for the purchase of the property. So it's really, really important that all that information is collated as soon as possible. One question that does come from clients as well, it's quite common, and it's a very reasonable question, is different companies have different regulations around source of funds. So it may be that an estate agent is able to accept just proof of the funds being there, whereas a lender might accept initial information about the gift of funds. But as conveyancers, the lenders will then rely on us to do those further checks. So it will sometimes appear that we're asking for more than other companies, but it's because we're all regulated in different ways. And really, at the end of the day, we're regulated the most on this, and we have to see the documentary evidence. So gift of funds, really common. Get that person on board right at the start of the process and reassure them that is part of the regulations. And I think just bring them into that process as soon as possible, and getting that information ready at early doors is, again, really, really important. Again, your conveyancer should give you lots of help around this and give you information so you know exactly what you need to be getting, and try and provide it all as early as possible.
Yeah, I do think that sometimes people forget that when they are getting the money from Bank of Mum and Dad suddenly think, hold on a second, I don't want to share all of my bank details with my children. So it is quite important for them to know that this is going to happen, that they've got to share that information.
Yeah, and very important to know that we're not trying to be offensive or intrusive.
Yeah.
We are just, it's our legal duty to ask these questions. Sometimes giftors might also think they can send the funds directly to the conveyancing firm. They can't, because they're not the client of the firm. So we'll have to see a paper trail of the gift of funds in their bank account being transferred to our actual client, and the client is the one that we can accept the funds from, but not the third party. So there's just different processes and procedural points that you do need to cover off. So having a really good conveyancer to guide you through that is key.
So why is a cash contribution, and I know I'm asking this question because I finally understand why it is important. Why is a cash contribution not always an adequate source of funds?
Well, let's go back to the very concept of evidence and sourcing funds. How do you evidence cash? It's almost impossible to prove where the cash has come from because it's cash. So because of the inherent problem of being able to provide the evidence around it, most conveyancers will not accept cash as an adequate source of funds method. It just doesn't satisfy the legislation and the duty put upon us as conveyancers. It doesn't mean that it's suspicious, that's not what we're saying. It's just that criteria that we have to satisfy in doing our own checks will just not ever get satisfied. Furthermore, if you have funds that are cash, but then legitimate source of funds for, say, the sale of a property or savings, and it's all intermingled in one account, that becomes really problematic as a conveyancing firm to accept as well, because then you can't tell out of those funds in that one account how much is the legitimate source of funds and how much is the cash, and it all becomes intermingled, and that again is really difficult for conveyancers to prove, and that can be really frustrating when clients get to that point as well. So really important to understand really early on why cash is an issue for conveyancing firms, because it's most likely that the firm will be unable to act.
Yeah, that is quite scary,
It
really.
is.
It is. So,
yes.
So saying the source of this money was under my mattress doesn't work.
It doesn't. And also having a wedding and You know, if you've got very generous guests at the wedding and they're going to give you cash gifts and you've just, you know, kept that in a bag under your bed until you buy a property, again, that would just fail the source of funds checks, because there is just no way of evidencing, you know, 10, 11, 12 people how they sourced that cash payment to give to you. And, you know, it's almost impossible to source.
So what if I got, like you say, really great relatives have pinned loads of money on me because I've got married and I've got £10,000?
Yeah.
What if I put that in my bank and it's in my bank account, you know, for 6 months, 8 months, a year?
Or if it goes in with your savings as well, that's from salary, it all becomes intermingled in the same pot. So if you're using savings and some of that cash contribution, you can't tell what part of that is the cash and what part is the savings. But even though if it's sat in your account for however long, it doesn't matter. The fact is it came in as a cash deposit and it cannot be sourced to where it originally came from.
Right. So there isn't a length of time at which you get to the point. So say it was in my bank account for 10 years. You would go back 10 years to actually look at that £10,000 that I paid into cash to find out where it came from.
We have to investigate every penny that you put towards the purchase of a property. And
okay.
It's our duty to do so, and we you know, we have to look at every explanation and go back to that you know, incredibly high bar that we have to satisfy. And it does not mean it's suspicious. We're not accusing anyone of anything. It just means we can't complete our checks and we will be unable to act in that scenario if that is the full source of the funds.
Yeah.
But also, if it gets intermingled with a legitimate source, you have then the other issue to deal with that I mentioned.
Yeah, I suppose I had thought that there was this, maybe it's a misconception that you only go back and look at the last 6 months worth of you know, source. So I didn't realise you go as far back.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be that someone's been saving for 10 years to purchase the property of a property. So if they're saving for 10 years, we're not asking for 10 years worth of bank statements, but we'll be asking for recent pay slips, and we'll be asking for bank statements for, say, the past 5 years, a few for the last, to show that gradual build up of funds. So we're just looking for a clear explanation and wealth check to see, you know, that explanation is plausible and it's backed by this evidence that we've now collated. And that standard that we have to satisfy is reasonableness. You know, we're not FBI agents, we're not, you know, we have to go to any degree like that. It might feel to some clients that we are, but we're not. We just want to get a documentary trail that is reasonable and acceptable to show that we've done our due diligence around this thing. And that's as simple as it is.
So the small takeaway from this is make sure you can, you know, document your source of funds as early as possible.
As early as possible, and seek guidance and clarity. I think that's key. It can be complicated, but it doesn't have to be if you've got clear advice.
Thank you, Tina.
You're
That's
welcome.
been really helpful.
Thank you.
Learned a few things as well today.
Fantastic.